Commission. Can we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Nguyen?
Here.
Commissioner Solomon?
Here.
Commissioner Chen?
Here.
Commissioner Hensley?
Here.
Commissioner Johnson, absent. Chair Samples.
Here. Okay. Would Commissioner Hensley, since it's his first night, like to lead us in the salute to the flag?
Hope I remember the words.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay. First item, approval of the order of agenda. Is there a motion to approve the order of the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Pass. Additional items for immediate consideration, blue folder items. It looks like we have two blue folder items. One looks like, Marnie, this is an additional update to the Moss Adams report that we already received?
Yes.
Okay, and the other one looks like the response from LA County on the fire department feasibility study.
Right, and the PowerPoint presentation for that report.
Okay, thank you. Is there a motion to receive and file the blue folder items?
Motion to receive and file blue folder items.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Consent calendar. Let's see. We only have one item on the consent calendar. Does anyone want to pull the consent item, or do we have any discussion? So let's see. Oh, do we have any member of the public that wants to talk about our affidavit of posting? Probably not. So is there a motion to approve the consent calendar?
So moved.
Second.
In favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Welcome, sir. Okay, let's see. Excluded consent calendar, public participation in non-agenda items. This section is intended to provide members of the public with the opportunity to comment on any subject that does not appear in this agenda for action. This section is limited to 30 minutes. Each speaker will be afforded 3 minutes to address the commission. Each speaker will be permitted to speak only once. Written requests, if any, will be considered first under this section. I have no written requests. Do we have any non-agenda items from the public? Seeing none, we can move on to old business. We have no old business. New business. First item is receive and file the Moss Adams Internal Controls Review and Financial Risk Assessment. And Marnie, I think you're on.
Sure. Tonight we have with us a guest from down the hall. Eleanor is here, city clerk, because she's been coordinating our internal audit work with Moss Adams, and that's our other guest, Mark Stranka from Moss Adams, whose firm prepared the report. So the report is something that this commission has been asking for, and so here it is. It's got some observations and some recommendations, and then we as staff have put in some responses, whether they clarify what's been going on, talk about things that we have implemented in the meantime, or just, again, provide further clarification. So Mark has a PowerPoint that he's going to walk you through with the report. Turn it over to him.
Good evening. Mark Storenka from Moss Adams. I know you've been anxiously awaiting this report for just a little bit of time. So it'll be a little bit of an abnormal presentation in that so much time has passed from when the work was done. I think one of the biggest takeaways, hopefully for you, from the report in terms of over the time that's passed since the work was done, that although it hasn't been validated, the city has obviously made a lot of progress. So the city hasn't been sitting on the report. They've been making use of it, which is what you hope. And certainly when we're doing these assessments, often our clients are making improvements as we're doing the work, and they're looking, becoming aware of opportunities for improvement. So a few introductory comments. So when we do work like this, finding in an internal audit realm is different than a finding in external audit. External audit findings a bad thing. We don't want findings. In this regard, it's kind of our job. Every finding is an opportunity for improvement. So we're trying, in essence, to find as much as we can, because they're all opportunities for the city to operate better, and that's what this is all about. So it's not about the number. Is it too few, too many? It's more about the nature of them. And ultimately, it's about what the city does in response to them. And obviously, the city has been active, as you can see in the management responses, which is great. So if you want to go, maybe stop there for a second. So I'm going to sort of give our usual, when we present reports, we sort of talk about what our role is, what our general focus is, not just in terms of this report, but what we're trying to accomplish in total as the internal auditor. I'll walk you a little bit through how we did the work, which is very straightforward, no real secret sauce there. And then I'm going to give you a high-level overview of the results, kind of what our takeaways were. The one challenge here is diving into the details are kind of 2 or 3 years old. So that might be a little challenging to do, but we can certainly talk about as well as the progress that's been made along them. And then I'll sort of tell you what I think some of this information means, at least to us, in terms of looking forward. Sound good? Okay. So real briefly, our role is pretty broad, as in a way as it should be. So as internal auditor, what we want to be looking for of how do we identify and find ways for the city to reduce risks? How do we identify and find ways for the city to strengthen controls? Looking at performance of different functions within the organization. How can we improve efficiency? How can we improve effectiveness? And how do we bring in best practices? So we work with lots of cities, so we bring ideas from how someone else does something. Doesn't mean it's better than here, but it might be, good food for thought in terms of how we can do things differently. And sometimes those things make sense here, and some, in a particular municipality, and sometimes they don't. And that's just fine. It's really about just bringing ideas. Go ahead. So our programs by design, and really we've sort of been in, I'll say, sort of the ramp-up mode, and really sort of kicked into gear in terms of a full internal audit program yet, but I think we will be in FY 1920, is to try to touch different areas of the city each year and in kind of different ways. So we want to be finding ways to reduce risks and improve compliance and controls and improve performance, efficiency and effectiveness of performance in different areas of the city. So you can't be everywhere all the time. So you want to be sort of chipping away, making your way around the city, touching different things in different ways. And if there was an endless budget, you still couldn't even be everywhere all the time. But we want to be continually moving the city forward. And again, really the goal is to help the city do what it does tomorrow better than it does today, better serve the community. Okay? All right. So process. So really this project really had two elements. So what I would call a traditional internal controls review. So what we do is we look at what we would call key controls across the city, and we're trying to get a sense of what we would call controls design. Are controls in place, and do they look like they have the opportunity to be effective? We're not doing any testing at this point, so we don't know how effective that they are. We're really looking, do they exist? Or if they exist, are they, do they reflect best practice? Are they up to date? Where are there gaps? And because that's what then sort of the point of doing this type of work is to guide the internal audit program going forward. So it's really informative versus really testing. And then we also had a risk element to it of looking at financial functions. So we took the same functions that we look at for internal controls, and then we added some additional functions that we typically look at when we're doing an enterprise risk assessment. And that's, I guess, the other thing I should mention is, in this case, this is kind of the one time that we'll be coming to you with something that is kind of citywide relative to control. So this is truly an enterprise controls review where we're looking at a relatively high level across the city versus delving down into particular functions. We're doing sampling and testing, or really looking at compliance of the controls and their effectiveness. So how do we do the work? So we talk to folks across the city who are relevant to these different activities. Yes, a lot of these activities are within finance, but as you'll see in the report, lots of these activities, as would be expected, are also decentralized in other departments of the city, so we talk to relevant people there. We do things what we call walkthroughs, where we say, okay, don't just tell us how you do it, show us. So show us on screen an application you might use, show us a form that you use, what do you do next when you get this, what do you do, so that we're getting some visual understanding versus just hearing it. And then as part of this, we do a survey. So instead of just talking to the folks that we interview, we do a survey to get broader input on how the controls are working specifically. And then as we go through the process, and certainly at the end, reviewing the results with management. And you can see when the actual assessment work was done was October 2016 through April 2017. So we always kind of start with commendations. I would really kind of focus you. These are just some examples of commendations, things that we, when we're in there, we're working well. Another way of thinking of commendations are we're looking at lots and lots of controls. So there's lots of controls that aren't covered in the report. And those are all, in essence, commendations, because it's not something that we're finding an opportunity for improvement. I think one of the good ones here is the second bullet in terms of, again, we have to, in all of this put in the context, this was, a couple, 3 years ago, but at that time, one of the things that the management team did was, and some municipalities do, is kind of have built into their sort of standard operating procedures is, let's be looking at what other cities are doing, looking at what things they're running into issues with, and having that being inputs to us of flags that we should have. So not just what's happening here, but what's happening elsewhere. You can go ahead, Eleanor. Thank you. So here's an overview of the internal controls results. So this is just a count of issues, findings or opportunities for improvement. And I would just give you some themes for this. And the first theme would be, we didn't find anything here out of the ordinary than any of the other cities that we work with. And that doesn't mean that's good, doesn't mean it's bad, it just means it's sort of typical. And so what do we need, what does that mean? So one of the biggest threads through these findings is opportunities to improve policies and procedures. Every one of our municipalities is that policies and procedures are not sexy, they take time to work on, they get out of date quickly, and we often don't have time to be working on them. Policies and procedures are important for two primary reasons. One is protecting institutional knowledge, so as people leave, we don't want that knowledge going out in their heads, we want it down on paper, but also for if someone's not in for a certain reason, they're on vacation, they're on sick leave, or they're at training, how does the person who's backing them up know what to do? And if it's just in someone's head, then less likelihood that it's going to be done as efficiently and effectively. The other thing is, a lot of these activities do happen across the city. They're not just, people often think, okay, we're talking internal controls, that's just finance. Well, that's not just finance. Finance plays a big role in it, but internal controls, of course, pervade the whole city, but it even pervade the whole city in terms of financial activities. And so those policies and procedures provide the mechanism for having consistent operation across the city. An example counter to that, which is very typical, is cash handling. So cash handling is an activity that happens in multiple departments. We're taking in money at various events, and guaranteed, and as we found here, is happening differently across the city. Again, not unusual, but clearer policies and procedures, training on those policies and procedures can help gain more consistency of decentralized activities. Grants management would be another classic example of that. We take in money from different sources to the city into different departments. We administer those grants. We do that at varying levels of effectiveness in terms of administering them, reporting on them. The importance here is we want to make sure as a city that we're recouping every dollar that we can relative to grants, that we're not leaving any money on the table, that we're not having to pay money back because we didn't give the reporting on time or things like that. And so having that consistency across the city in terms of policies and procedures and then training relative to those, again, that's a common element across here. We also have some things relative to manual activities in terms of time cards, being able to leverage systems. There's systems activities going on for the city right now, being able to leverage automation more because that helps us with controls. If we're counting on people to do everything, then we're going to have inherent opportunities for human error. And maybe maybe a couple other comments. So relative to one of the other themes was kind of roles and responsibilities that existed in one significant place between payroll and HR, and then another place between the treasury, clerk, and finance. The latter is because their roles are prescribed and they're kind of segmented in a relatively unusual way here compared to other cities, in getting coordination and integration between those and clarity of those roles and responsibilities. So in those two cases, work has already been done and been presented to you on those roles and responsibilities. So examples of things that were identified and have been worked on. Revenue might be another area that I mentioned. It's classic for cities, so think of AR. I don't know what all your backgrounds are, but accounts receivable, recovering all the revenue that you're due is an important thing. AR is also a decentralized activity, kind of by definition across cities. If we ask the city, what's your total AR across the city? That's a very difficult question to answer because that information resides in multiple systems or applications across the city. So that's typically an opportunity for improvement. I think I might stop there. And should I just keep going? And then okay, we'll keep going. Go ahead. Okay. So I'm going to shift to talking about risks. First, let me give a little preamble to it. So this is a summary of what's in the report. The risk rating, the second column, is ultimately kind of what we've rated at the risk. That's a reflection of the next three columns. Likelihoods, so likelihood of a negative event. So is something negative associated with payroll and HR likely to happen? So we say in this case, moderately likely. What's the impact of a negative event? So something negative happens, how big of a impact typically financially is it going to have on the city? And so we evaluate that. And then what's not typical in a risk assessment is what we call trajectory. Because a risk assessment by definition is a point in time. But if I were a decision maker and you say, okay, well, let's say revenue, yeah, sure, pick any one, it doesn't matter. Revenue, so you're saying the risk is moderate to high, but what are we doing anything about that? Or if we're working on it, and that might be decreasing. Well, to me, that's important to know. If we're doing nothing about it at this particular time, it's going to be flat. Or maybe it's increasing because we're doing nothing about it. But getting a sense of what the context of a point in time is to us is meaningful, so we factor that into our risk rating. So what would be some takeaways from this? So I'll talk about this slide, and the next slide has the other risk categories. So revenue is the one kind of moderate to high because of the points I was making earlier. Revenue, of course, is important to the city. AR is typically a challenge for cities, making sure that we're as diligent as we are in recovering all of our AR, A, knowing what it is, B, recovering as much as we can, and then C, as we outsource that to third parties, which is very typical, make sure that those third parties are working at their utmost best on our behalf. If you want to go to the next one, thank you. Asset management and capital program. So the reason this is moderate to high is an overall rating. So Redondo Beach is not flush with money. Redondo Beach has a fairly sizable, at the time it was about $100 million capital need. We didn't have a number on deferred maintenance, but I would wager it's a sizable dollar amount here. And so putting our capital programs, what we often see with cities and counties is those capital programs, what we call throughput, is typically not optimal, meaning we're dedicating these dollars to it, we're getting that money spent and applied each year fully. And then the other part is, do we even have our arms around what the full deferred maintenance cost is? Because all cities still have this, they typically have it anyway, but still coming from the Great Recession, the recession in 2008, cities are still recovering from that from a deferred maintenance standpoint, because even though finances have improved, it's really hard to, it's one thing to have enough money to do what we need to do today. It's another thing to have enough money to do things that we wanted to do yesterday and haven't had the money to do yet. So that's an area of focus in terms of risk, because as that deferred maintenance grows, it's kind of like to change your oil. Pay me now or pay me later. If we're able to take things at the time, it's going to cost less than it's going to be in the future. Organization and staffing is really kind of about the policies and procedures. Organization and staffing kind of becomes a risk of that. If we don't have a robust set of policies and procedures, then we're not operating as efficiently, as effectively as we can in our individual duties. But then as we look at those duties between and across departments, that's where you can gain additional efficiencies. And if we're not firing on all cylinders within our individual duties, guaranteed we're not firing on all cylinders looking across and trying to gain efficiencies that way. I think I'll probably stop there. So let's go to the next slide. So here we're, in essence, coming off of doing this work and maybe the sort of the discussions of the year or two following it. These were the areas that we were suggesting to the city to have focus as a result of this work. So the first two have been addressed, and they've been presented to you. The third item, inventory and development of policies and procedures, that's underway. And the reason that one started, not only because it's a beneficial thing to do, but policies and procedures guaranteed is going to be a multi-year process for the city of developing and updating those. And so getting that process started right away gives that legs moving forward. And so that has started. The fourth bullet, development and delivery of a fraud and waste abuse program. So the city has an ethics hotline. I would say the city doesn't have a fraud, waste, and abuse program. There is opportunity for improvement there. That is part of the current work plan. And then the rest are really just areas that we would address anyway, but in terms of the next step in terms of controls is now to start doing testing of controls. The one ironic benefit of you getting this report now instead of when it was done is that the city has had time to work on things. And typically when we do these reviews, I would say at the time, we would probably say there was a lot of work to do for the city. And doing a bunch of testing right on the heels of that is kind of just like piling on. It's like, we've got these findings, and now you just, so we know we have holes, and now you're testing to tell me again that we have holes. That doesn't really help. And so we often will wait a year, especially in areas that we think that work needs to be done to do testing because, again, just giving more findings isn't really that productive. So that time has been there, which is great. So I think rolling into testing now is actually very appropriate. And so it's just going to be a matter of picking where we start because we'll do 1 or 2 areas per year because, again, we don't have unlimited budget. Would you go to the next slide, please? And actually, this is just recapping what I said about those first sort of 4 items. The first 2 items are in the clarification of roles and responsibilities, so that has been done. The policies and procedures has been started this fiscal year. It'll carry in the next fiscal year, as well as the fraud, waste, and abuse program development. With that, I'm going to stop talking.
Commissioner Chun.
Mark, thank you for that report. And just from a high-level perspective, you gave us the color charts, which is very helpful. From a high level, what's your sense in terms of the city as it compares to other similar cities? Are we orange? Are we green? Are we red versus others in similar revenue base?
So to use your color palette, I'd say you're probably like the yellow to orange. But I would say, so if orange is worse than yellow, I would say, in perspective, I would probably say 16, 17 more orange, and today more yellow, based on the progress that's been made. Again, we haven't validated the progress, but it's obvious that the work has been done. One of the things I didn't mention initially, this is a little bit speculative, but you have a different CFO than you did at the time. I think there's more attention to this work than there was then. I think that's reflective in the progress that's made. So to answer your question, I'd say yellowish now, and I would say pretty typical, or I would say kind of middle of the road, right? There are some cities, or we'll say cities and counties, municipalities, that are really strong in this area. And there are those that are certainly worse. And so you're not at any ends of the spectrum.
Okay, thank you. And then just a few more high-level questions regarding, this was done in 2017. You've already seen improvements. What's your general response you've seen from cities, municipalities, and counties once your report is done? And in particular, right, staff doesn't necessarily agree, as we've seen. So what's your response to that when there's a disagreement in terms of your assessment and then their assessment, and then in terms of them making improvements?
Yeah, so I'll tread on that one a little lightly. In this type of work, we don't get exceptions. We don't disagreement. But I think 2 things were contributing to that in this particular engagement. One was, I don't think necessarily all of the right people perhaps were involved in the review of our work at the time. I will have you know there were multiple rounds of review of our work, much more than normal. So it should have been really sort of buttoned down in terms of agreement. I think based on the personnel at the time, maybe that wasn't the most fertile review, I'll say, by the city at the time. And so that's why there's disagreement now. In some cases, I think the more abundant sort of response is progress has been made. So the view now is different than the view then because activity and progress has been made, which is great. And that's what you want. The other answer to your question, which I was kind of alluding to earlier, is often when we're doing this work, as soon as we start to identify things, typically the cities start working on them. So they don't wait till our report comes in, and you wouldn't want them, right? If there's something you can do now, do it now. So sometimes our reports have to be updated as we're going, which is totally fine, or we have a finding and then part of the recommendation we say continue to do what you're doing because we're acknowledging that the client has started to make progress. And of course that's the case here because of the amount of time that's elapsed. But thankfully that's the case, that there's been a lot of progress. So that's a good thing for all of us.
Right, and then I'll follow one quick one too. In terms of high-level perspective, like the revenue, is that just specific to City of Redondo Beach in general, and then asset management and AR, or is that pretty much across?
These are all common. There's nothing here
Thank you.
that's sticking out like a sore thumb.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Commissioner Sullivan?
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
And thank you, when you identified the number of issues, it was really helpful to see that, frequency doesn't necessarily equate with urgency.
Correct.
And for you to lay out for us the risk level and the likelihood of occurrence was really helpful in further identifying or peeling back a layer on that. When, on this slide that we have up now, it is the focus on and it was one of the priorities, clarify roles and responsibilities. If I remember correctly, when we had that report in March on roles and responsibilities, some of the clarification or there was going to require either municipal code changes, charter changes, or city policy changes. And you're recognizing or issuing a status here of completed. So can you reconcile that for me, please?
Sure. Yes. So completed here means our work on that was completed.
Got it. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you.
And Marnie or Eleanor can certainly update on the city's aspect of that if they.
Yeah, so the reports, all three reports, the report you're seeing tonight, the two that you saw previously, all three are going to go to the City Council in September. So then it will be up to them to provide direction on those kinds of items, the charter changes or municipal code changes.
The other recommendations.
Yes.
Okay, and Mr. Chung touched on this a little bit. When we're talking about, I call it leakage, everybody refers to it in a little bit different way. The things that were alerting to me were the third-party sources that we're using for revenue collection and some of the issues with that, and the P cards that are being used. So can you elaborate a little bit on how you came to identify these issues and how far down the road we went with those? If we're able to identify a percentage or an idea of what we're losing or not seeing and along those lines?
Sure. So for sure, not the latter. So we didn't have testing or anything that might identify, I'll say, magnitude of potential problem. I'll start with P cards. So P cards, they're a great tool. It's something that you would want your city using. Challenge that can come with that is, do we have too many or too few? How are they being used? So we identified some examples in there of, even though I think the city probably feels like they provided explanations for them, okay, it's human nature. People work around stuff. And so, and nothing's perfect. And so you just want to make sure that we have good controls relative to P cards. So I think one of the examples we gave were, using 2 different P cards to pay for something. Well, that might happen in an exception. And I'm not trying to blow that out of the norm or in terms of, or make it a bigger deal than it is. But there are challenges relative to P cards, even though it's a great tool. And so you want to make sure that they're being used the way that they're intended. And that takes a little bit of discipline. And they are, even though there's a centralized reporting of it, which is one of the benefits of a P card, there is decentralized usage of it. And that decentralized usage needs to have those controls to make sure that when we get the reporting, that's not when we're figuring out that we use it the way we want or not.
And that's a great place for me to ask the next question then is, when you talk about the, part of the compliance is automated because it's
You get the reporting.
immediate, it's reported.
Yep.
But the, so the backside of it is decentralized. Are there systems, the manual systems, or can we automate systems in order to clean that up? Or what's the best methodology to clean something like that up?
The automated systems are the limits on the amount, right, that you can use in the P card. The non-automated part is hey, I'm going to go make a purchase, right? Did I have the proper authority and approval to do that, sort of the oversight and supervision of it? Which,
So I equate that to IT, where there's limited permissions for certain access.
and that's what you have on the P card, right?
Okay.
Gene, do you mind if I follow up so that?
Please, go ahead,
we-
yes.
We don't do P cards 3 times?
Yeah,
So
you betcha.
I just want to follow up on your
Yeah.
P
Yeah,
card.
yeah.
So you mentioned that one of the automated portions is the limit on on the individual cards. So
Correct.
you've got a certain amount of employees that have the P cards, and then typically the process would be on a monthly basis. And you said the word, it's a reconciliation of the P card. So that bill goes, if I have the P card, the bill goes to him, my supervisor. Is there a strong review of what's being charged on the P cards? And is that signed off on before the bills are paid?
My recollection is that there's a reasonable review of that, and so really the opportunities are on the front end, on the actual use of it. Are we having, in essence, the preventive controls to make sure we're using it right? The detective controls are, I think, there.
Yeah.
And then, and I would say, even though I think that there was disagreement in the report, the sort of the penalty for misuse. And some cities are very strict on that. You know, it's like 1 strike, you're out. Sometimes it's 3 strikes, you're out. But it's making sure that we're, diligent in that.
And one of the things with the P cards is they've got small limits, really. And what is?
They
you-
do.
Do you know the P card limit?
I forget what it is. It's,
It varies by employee
Level.
and what their function is in the city. A lower level employee is going to have a lower level limit and
So what you
that's
want to
what-
do is make sure that Gene and I are not going to lunch and, things like that, and then it's, so, okay, fine. You see,
Yeah, and-
Don't do it again, and that's pretty much it. You see it the second time, and now you've got a
then you,
correction. Well,
right, you pull the card.
You have
right?
some, yes.
You lost your privilege.
Lost your
Yeah.
privilege.
And limits are not only dollar amounts, they're also where you can make purchases.
Yes, so you've got some,
Merchant control.
who's the bank for your P card system?
U.S.
We
banks.
use-
US Bank. Yeah, so they can, I know US Bank can build in controls for where
the
you can,
merchant.
what you can, yeah, it's the merchant controls, the level 1, 2, and 3 level of detail and things like that.
And I was just going to go back to your first question, because I took the second one first. Third-party contracts, certainly when they have revenue associated with it, which AR collections isn't the only type that you would have that, but just in general, an area that cities are typically not so good at is good contracts and good contract management of third-party contracts. So that's an area, and you will see that we'll want to have a focus on is doing audits of those contracts. We often do that when they're coming up for renewal, because then that equips the city to have good leverage in terms of, at a minimum, negotiating with the contractor if they're going to renew, but if you're going to go out to bid for those services, to then be in position to have stronger contract language in terms of performance and reporting to the city, because again, that's something just cities don't it's like not their forte.
Well, from an organizational standpoint, it seems that there's, and your reports address it, overlapping roles and responsibilities. And then you have the danger of somebody who is, as you expressed, out for a period of time, and while there's an institutional knowledge, it may lay solely with that person. So when that person is not available, or when there's an overlapping role and responsibility, perhaps everybody's looking at each other to monitor or audit that revenue.
Right.
And if not getting, it sounds like it may in some situations, not in all, maybe not getting monitored. We are victims of our own history here in Redondo Beach, and I'm sure in cities all across the state where we've had problems with employees and credit cards in the past, where we've had problems where we would lease a parking lot and there was nobody monitoring whether or not we were getting the revenue for it.
And that would be a more classic parking, ambulance, things like that, where there's revenue associated and they're typically outsourced.
So, from an organizational standpoint, it sounds like we're identifying these issues, and in some situations, the staff is disagreeing. It sounds like in some situations, it's a staffing issue, and in some situations, it's an issue of whose responsibility, where does this ultimately lay? And please
or-
tell me if I'm mischaracterizing it.
You might be a little bit there. I think in those cases, those are just, I would say, clear opportunities for improvement to put the city in a better position to be able to manage and maximize those contracts, to make sure you're getting what you're paying for, the maximum of what you're paying for, especially when it has revenue associated with it.
Our department heads have so much autonomy based on the current situation to go ahead and secure contracts within their departments. And we don't really have a bidding process. So, that oversight seems to be something that is at issue.
And what I'm getting at is, once those are in place, making sure that we're managing those contracts as effectively as we can.
Okay,
right?
great.
That we're getting good service, we're getting exactly what we're paying for, we have good contract terms. In a lot of cases, it's just not even getting good reporting. So we don't even necessarily know, I'm not saying here, but it would be common, we don't even know if we're getting all of the revenue we should, because we're not getting really good reporting. And so when we do these reviews, as often one of our people is both a CPA and a JD, is how do we make that contract language better on behalf of the city? That's why I was saying, prior to renewing a contract, that's really good timing, because it arms the city with better information to go into those discussions, or like I said, if they're going back out to bid.
Okay. One more question for now, please. So much time has passed, we talked about that, and it seems like maybe there was some back and forth between your organization and the staff as clarification as to what we were going to be doing here. Why do you think, in your opinion, it took so long for us to go from A to Z here?
I'm going to let the city answer that.
Our first plan was to just keep this one internal and take it to dictate what our work plans would be going into the future. And then those work plans come before you, the results of those items in the work plan, and this was just the basis for it. Once you requested, then we worked on.
An overall strategic plan,
Yeah.
Marnie, or
Yeah.
interdepartmental? Overall strategic plan towards this. Okay, all right, thank you.
Commissioner Johnson?
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
Great report. So a few small things.
Sure.
So the AR, you mentioned some outsourcing of receivables. Is that past due receivables, or is that like a standard process?
So yeah, past due, so like what a typical would be, just like would be for our firm, we get reports 30, 60, 90, 120 days, you go from green to yellow to red to orange, right? And someone starts to say, hey, you've got X, thousands of dollars in over 120 days. What's the deal? Is that for us, just use us as an example, are those dollars you're writing off, right? And so you're not going to collect, or is that just something the client hasn't paid for some reason, so go work on that? And we're an accounting firm, so we're pretty good at identifying those dollars, even though we're a big firm. So it's kind of the same thing here, is having a really good bead on how much AR is outstanding and to what degrees, and because typically the longer it is, the less likely you're going to recover it. And so we even do things like, we get charged by the mothership for having long outstanding AR, because they're assuming we're not going to recover it. So we're paying, in essence, a fee to the firm for, right? So it's like, so we're motivated to not.
They're being your bank.
That's right. Exactly. Yep.
So in the same area of AR and billing, there was a comment, and I know it was a long time ago, but it said that finance was creating invoices for other departments without asking for support for the amount that were being billed. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
No, because, well, I don't have the personal knowledge of it. I also know that there was disagreement on that. I would just say, I think in some of the cases, and I kind of meant to say this at the beginning, so when we do this work, we talk to a variety of people. We get their responses, their verbal responses, their documentation that they provide. So I'm quite confident in that particular case, whatever the details were, that wasn't there. But that doesn't mean that that's the case in every case. Or perhaps that person didn't think that documentation existed, but it really did. To me, I would just say this isn't a defensive mode, is if someone doesn't know, like if someone says a policy or procedure on this doesn't exist, but it does, but it's a policy and procedure that's relative to what they do, and they don't know about it, then it doesn't exist, right? So it's like perception is reality. So in that case, unfortunately, I can't give
This wasn't a pervasive thing.
No.
Okay.
But when you see something, typically things aren't a one-off. There are some times that they're a one-off.
Yeah.
But
And of course, any invoice billed to anybody without, support attached to it is something that's going to draw a lot of attention.
But I'm not making a mountain out of a molehill on that, for sure.
One of the things that does seem to be pervasive is outdated or lack of policies and procedures.
For sure.
And I know Marnie operates on what I look at as a skeleton crew when I look at your head count, and I'm like, wow, that's not an easy job. So that's a difficult thing. And it's not just finance that will be writing all the policies and procedures. It's difficult for an organization to sit down with a blank sheet of paper and start writing procedures.
Right.
How, are you providing any assistance to them with
Yeah.
boilerplate policies and procedures?
Yep. So I'll talk about that some. So we do this for almost all of our clients because they almost all have this need to varying degrees, but they all have it. So what we typically do here is in what's in our work plan. So we do an inventory first. Say, okay, what do you have? We compare that to what you should have, best practice, identify the gaps, and then work with the city to prioritize those gaps. So that becomes kind of the work plan. And then what I'll say typically do, it's not the same for every client, but we'll either help them define kind of a standard policy format. We'll bring boilerplate or example policies and procedures. Typically what we end up sort of needing to do to be helpful is sort of fueling the process. And so instead of just saying, here is 100 things you need to do, go get them, they'll be like, well, we didn't do them because we didn't have the time. So how do we suddenly have the time now? So we do end up typically fueling that process to help. What we just don't do is we don't, even technically we could write the policy procedure, the city adopts it, so it's the city's policy and procedure. We don't typically go that far because we're not supposed to be auditing our own work. So what we try to do is help them get it a good way there, but make sure that the city it's truly making it their policy and procedure, so it's not Moss Adams auditing Moss Adams policy and procedure. So
is there a central repository for city policies and procedures? Like, can you go to a portal on an internal website or something, and here they are?
Right, yes.
And are we having a policy now to update them on a rotating basis?
Usually it's, as a need arises, some process changes, something like that. Oh, we'd better update the policy, or, an audit recommendation that we want to comply with. But generally, we're looking forward to Moss Adams' assistance in looking at all of them across the board, and, in them providing examples and whatnot, as opposed to us just going and Googling and coming up with something that then they come back and audit and say, well, it doesn't have this or that. We're looking forward to them providing the examples of ones that are, truly helpful.
Yeah, I suppose I shouldn't be asking you to keep them updated before we have a current...
I'm fairly confident we'll make recommendations about the need to review them periodically, yeah.
So Marnie, on your staff, is there anybody who is a CPA or has a background in auditing or understanding internal controls?
No.
So that's something, that I think should be considered, because nobody else is really going to spot those things. And Mark, as you know, really the city can't rely on you to come and tell them everything.
Can't be everywhere all the time,
Yeah,
right?
so-
Yeah.
But again, realizing that is one of the reasons for going out and, looking for somebody, a firm, to be our internal auditor, and then
Right.
choosing Moss Adams
Right.
for that function.
So I would just say to your point, and that's why it's not just policies and procedures, but then it's training, and typically we do look to finance to do a lot of the training and monitoring, not to pile on them, but you can't just have policies and procedures and then say, go follow them, right? Because they'll get them, they might not even look at them, they might not understand them. So some amount of training,
Yeah.
and then some amount of, hey, let's periodically take a look and see what now that's part of what our role is, but it's also, in a way, to your point, but it's ongoing management's role to be, as controls, to be monitoring things too.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, is that the practice itself is just a piece of paper, or it's just a bunch of data points on our website. It's actually the understanding of the staff of what they're supposed to do and doing it on a consistent basis, and then checking and following up on it. But I do want to emphasize that it is, in any organization, you can outsource auditing, but you cannot outsource ownership of the control.
And day-to-day management,
Yeah,
right?
so that's something that should be considered.
But I would just, in Marty, the city's defense, but also recognizing limited resources. And
No
so,
need to defend Marty. We know how small our
Yeah.
staff is. One small thing you mentioned, and I kind of caught it in passing, was deferred maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the risk areas. And I know that this commission, we had a long discussion over extending the depreciable lives of assets. So here we are with a backlog of deferred maintenance, yet, and admittedly and openly saying for budgetary reasons, we're extending the useful lives of these assets that we're having deferred maintenance on. So that's a compounding of a risk there, I think.
yeah, and it's slightly unfair, because it's, in a way, it's kind of just like pointing out the obvious, but you have to have discussions about it, because the acknowledgement just has to be, by doing that, we just know we're going to pay more later than we would now. That that's no panacea. It's like, oh, wow, you told us something we don't know, but you do have to factor that into your decision making.
And
Yeah.
it's, a matter of making the budget work. So
Yep.
there's, in various areas, there's comments about cash handling and things like that. People, in some festival or something, using multiple cash till, parking meters, things like that. Is there really much volume of cash that's touched by the city? And I would imagine, I know we're moving towards electronic parking meters, so, and that's its own problem, right? Because then you've got to go audit the electronic records, but. I know-
Sometimes they stop working. One of our clients said that.
Can't get your quarter in either.
Yeah, yeah.
So, is the overall volume of cash transactions anything that we need to be considering?
I don't know if you know, I don't know what the overall dollar value is. It's typically not, I want to say not material. I don't know if that's an accurate statement. It's on a relatively small amount. And so your exposure is not huge, but your likelihood of exposure is fairly high.
Yeah.
And again, this is not atypical, or it is common, not to use a double negative, but it's also something that's relatively easy to do a little bit better without too much effort. So it's something
Yeah.
that we should.
And I think, and I know we have some other comments, and my sort of overall feel on this is, outdated, lack of policies, procedures, and I think that, you really need personnel who can help train, and like one person is only going to make so much impact, but it's a lot better than not having somebody. So having somebody with that background, I think, is something that, in a $100 million budget, might be worthwhile, the investment. Thanks, Mark.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Chun?
Yeah, along the lines of the cash management, I noticed, talked about, cash being handled where it's not being checked for counterfeit, right? And then so I saw that it was in place where they have the marker and something else. I was just wondering, was that a large dollar amount over the years, or is it, I mean, because once a retailer receives a counterfeit bill, they can't deposit it.
Right. I don't know the answer to that, but I would not imagine we're talking large dollar amounts in terms of exposure. But cash handling, it happens pretty much every day, and there's some exposure every day.
So along the lines, though, what about on the procurement? It mentioned city property being used by employees. Is there enough controls on that? And is this a systematic problem?
So, again, I don't know because we haven't done testing. I know I'll say the city's rebuttal is that there are controls in place, but I think the items that or examples we were giving were things that could happen within the controls that exist. How rampant it is, don't know because we haven't done testing. It's actually not an area that we typically do testing in terms of use of city property, but it's more testing in terms of, as a surrogate it's how well do we inventory, how well do we account for it. I would tell you that most cities have a little bit of that happening because life would be simple if we weren't dealing with people, right? And we're not saying that it's a rampant thing, but I'll give you an example of a city. None of these are meant to be scare tactics, but they didn't have a tight control on their tires for their fleet, and lo and behold, there was all sorts of stuff happening with that. I'm not saying that's the case here, but it's some of those things are easy to get away with if we aren't diligent. Doing inventories is not something that I'd say cities are generally their top priority. They're not manufacturing companies, right? It's not part of their DNA. I'm not saying that the city's not doing it, and of course the city indicated that we're doing inventories. But again, it's just a place to be diligent.
All right, thank you. So staff, Marty, what's your sense in terms of inventory controls? If we see one laptop, that's pretty big money right there, right? I mean, so is there anything in terms of loss of stolen property in the years, and if something is found out regarding an employee using property for personal use, is there any discipline?
Yeah, so I would say it's definitely not rampant, because reading that, we all knew exactly the one employee that applied to. It was about 12 years ago. The employee was terminated, and that becomes a deterrent to others. So yes, it was handled very severely and taken care of.
What about currently? What's your sense in terms of inventory, loss of assets due to shrinkage or stolen? Pretty minimal or unknown?
We certainly think it's minimal, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mark, did you say tires?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, we've got maintenance yards and things like that. So, it starts with purchasing. You've got to have the ability to purchase
Right.
the stuff and then have it delivered in a place, go ahead and put it behind the truck yard or whatever. But I just want to point out, do not think that a facility's truck yard cannot be the source of a multi-million-dollar fraud, because it can.
It can.
There's Google any city around Southern California, and you might find people that bought millions of dollars of tires for Porsches and sold them for, a $200 tire for $75, and it's not hard to find. So, but you sell the stuff right out of the stock, the inventory, that's an inventory control. Well, you're going to run out of inventory.
Right.
Somebody has to have the authority to purchase
Yep,
large
yeah,
quantities of things. But it can be a very important problem.
Can happen.
So to follow up then, why was this highlighted then on number 5 if this was 12 years ago?
I don't know that we knew that was 12 years ago, but I don't know for sure.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay. Commissioner Hensley?
Yes, so I wasn't involved in the previous reviews, so I apologize if anything has already been covered that I asked. My question is back to the staffing levels, and it was throughout the responses, bare bones, lack of staff. Is there any plan to change that, to remedy some of these control issues, or is it just accepted and we can't do anything about that?
Dictated, and as you've seen from the budgets of the last couple years, we're decreasing the amount of staff. We're not increasing it.
So may that lead to more issues and more, if we already have a lack of staff and...
It definitely has the possibility. I know one of the comments made when Mark was here last was, oh, good, internal controls. If we strengthen those, we can cut our budget. And the answer is kind of, well, usually it's more costly to strengthen the controls than saving. It saves you in the long run from theft and embezzlement and things like that, but just your day-to-day operations, it's generally more expensive.
Okay, I think it'd be good to know at the end, we couldn't achieve these things because of staffing, and then maybe we can, that gives us more ammo to bring up in the future. Next, in the report, in the beginning of the report, it has suggested priorities to address over the next 6 to 12 months, and it lists revenue, billing, cash collection and handling, information technology, payroll and human resources, grants management, and purchasing and accounts payable. Mm-hmm. And my question is, over the next 6 to 12 months, was that when this report was made? Meaning
Yes.
Over 2 years?
Yes.
Almost 2 years ago?
Yeah.
So does that mean that it's obviously ongoing? So is there a new timeline or a new window to close these things, or to?
Well, so what I would say that is, you kind of have to recalibrate today what's happened over the past 18 to 24 months in terms of that. So what I think the easy answer is because that amount of, as I was mentioning earlier, because that amount of time has gone by, the city has had an opportunity to work on these things. Mm-hmm. And so instead of, so let me say it this way. So there's kind of 3 tiers of work relative to internal controls. The first tier is doing an enterprise review, which is this report. The next tier is often, but not always, we'll have, okay, I'll make one up, grants management. Okay, grants management is really weak. It's decentralized and we have very few controls there. Let's go do a deeper dive in terms of a review on grants management to help identify for the city what it needs to do to really strengthen grants management. And then the third tier would be then at some point in the future come back and do testing. So here we've had time has gone by to work on strengthening controls. So now it's just a matter of moving into a testing mode. And we would test in those areas. So we'll take them one at a time, sort of internal controls testing at a time, and just start doing that. And what that will do is, in essence, validate the work that has been done, and determine if more work needs to be done in terms of strengthening controls. But that time, more than that 6 to 12 months, has already passed. So,
okay.
Yeah.
And I have a very basic question from this material. In this material, they talked about P-card, which has already been discussed, and they also talked about CalCard. Is that the same thing?
One and the same.
Okay.
Our particular P card is the Cal card.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to make sure there weren't 2 systems out there or anything. Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Solomon?
Thank you. Mark, in the funding and economics section, there was a note in there about the city using progressive budgeting rather than zero-based budgeting, and that the department heads not having to justify their full spending needs, leading to less financially efficient operations. Mm-hmm. Is Redondo Beach typical or atypical in that situation?
Well, first, just to bring it current, is that situation still the same, or would we describe it differently?
We do not do zero-based budgeting, but everything beyond the core budget, it has to be justified. And a request is made for anything going beyond the core.
And just for my benefit as well, how would we define core budget?
Core budget, of course, it's been going since I don't know, 10 years maybe. And so it's kind of built in. It's the prior year's budget less the one-time items
Okay.
in there.
Okay. So I don't know in terms of percentages, I would probably say more cities than not do what we call progressive budgeting, or just budgeting based on last year's plus or minus in essence. It's not like that's the end of the world, but what it typically sort of circumvents is that, so the other extreme is kind of performance or priority-based budgeting, where you're really saying, we're deciding how to spend every dollar based on priorities. And so the most progressive cities will have a strategic plan, and they will make their budgeting based on the priorities in their plan. So the goals in their plan, and then the prioritization of the goals in their plan. It's not a panacea, right? Because you're in a way, you're still going through the same process, but you're more formalized going through the same process of really sort of evaluating, critiquing, and then deciding on how we want to spend our money. Now, just like if we talk to federal government, the biggest portions of their budgets are already locked in, or, health and human services and those things. But you could argue you can prioritize those too, right? It just, that's more philosophical. So I would say more common than not. The reason we point that out is just, I think it's healthy to be in a position of really going through and not just sort of taking last year by default. It's really evaluating how did we use the money last year. And then as part of that, I don't think we said this in there, but a lot of cities and counties, the way that they balance their budgets are positions that they don't end up filling over the course of the year. I'm not saying that's the case here, and it's probably less so because you're lean on staff, but that's often how cities balance their budgets, which is kind of a fictitious, you're not really managing your budget, right? And so all we're saying is it'd be better to have a little bit more introspection in terms of that, but you're not an outlier.
Well, what we find that we do here is that we're budgeting for, let's say, vacant positions, fully for vacant positions, we're budgeting for maximums. And then at mid-year, we know that, say, a personnel position is not going to get filled because of our budget constraints. We're budgeting for those positions, and we're borrowing against our CalPERS reserves in order to balance our budget every year. And then at mid-year, we're taking carryovers that haven't been then used up, and then paying back that money that we borrowed on our credit card. And so I don't know if that's the type of thing you consider to be typical or atypical in this situation. I guess that's more specifically what I'm talking about here. We want to go ahead and have our department head say, I need about this much money based on last year's budget, based on last year's staffing levels, and based on what I presume as the department head we're going to need going forward. Not saying, well, last year my core was 450,000. I used 350,000, but we're going to use 450,000 again this year.
Right.
That in tight budget constraints, to borrow money out of our CalPERS reserve in order to balance the budget in that situation, and then pay it off as a carryover because we didn't do that. That's the kind of progressive budgeting that I was wondering if is typical or atypical.
I don't think I have a good answer for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
In some of the things that your report came back where we had, we needed a more robust fraud, waste, and abuse program. We needed more robust controls for conflicts of interest. We needed more robust controls for some of the things we've already discussed, like P-card purchases and third-party vendor revenue situations. It seems like right now, the city manager is, for lack of a better way of putting it, the sheriff. So we're relying on somebody to report a problem rather than being proactive and looking for those problems. Quite frankly, with some of the issues that were identified, and you would talk about, we feel like our issues are minimal, but to quote, there are known unknowns. There are known knowns, but there are unknown unknowns. You think it might be minimal, but we have all these outdated policies and procedures that maybe are not identifying these problems. So that leads me to the question, this is going to be presented to the city council in September. Are these priorities that we're identifying as most important under item 5, is that part of the strategic plan that they're going to review in September? Or are they going to get this in September and then wait another year before it gets on the strategic plan?
If they're going to put something on the strategic plan, it would be the next one, which is 6 months from the last one.
October.
Yeah.
Okay, so they'll have another, so if they get this report in September, would they have an opportunity to say, wow, we've identified a lot of serious issues here. We've got likelihood of occurrence, moderate to high. We've got impact of occurrence, moderate to high. Risk mitigation, high. Is that something that they're going to be able to get this report in September and say, we're going to review this right away?
They certainly would have the opportunity to, yeah.
Okay.
And I think what will, perhaps a more sort of direct answer sort of the question, not that that wasn't direct, but or more helpful, is so what we have to define now is kind of one of our next activities is what's the focus of the fiscal year 1920 internal audit program. So we know we're going to be continuing to work on policies and procedures. We need to add a controls review or two to that. And I think that's part of, to me, that's part of sort of what goes to the council saying, here are the results, here's what we're focused on next as a result of this. And because that's what this was for, to inform the internal audit programs. And it's informing what we're doing now. And we also need to define what we're going to do the next fiscal year, which is now.
1920. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Commissioner Wynn?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mark.
You're welcome.
I'm just trying to get a macro overview understanding of timeline. So it sounds like stage 1's complete, identified. Stage 2 is trying to figure out the protocols, and then stage 3 is the testing. What's kind of like the macro timing right now to complete stage 2, and then how long does testing take to see if everything we did in stage 2 was done?
Sure. So if we call this, I would call it kind of stage. Yeah, all right, let's use your stages 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
So if stage 1 was this assessment, stage 2, for the sake of argument, was the last 18 to 24 months, so we've been working on things. Then stage 3, in terms of the testing, that's just ongoing, right? And so what we'll do, what is typical is those areas that Mr. Hensley was referring to, so AR, IT, AP, so we will start each year doing testing in some of those areas. And then next year we'll do testing in areas that we didn't do in the first year and the third. And eventually you sort of make your ways back around in terms of that's controls testing. We're also going to want to introduce some opportunities to improve performance, so efficiency and effectiveness, so that we're not just focused on controls. So that basically each year, so we could put probably a 5 to 10 year, for the sake of argument, work plan together, because we know we have a known limited budget, which there always is, right? It's not unlimited. And we could identify a long list of things to do, and then each year we're going to chip away at those. Eventually, you might say you get theoretically to now we're making our way all the way back around again, and enough time has gone by that it makes sense to do that. But I'd say we've got a good 5 years of hitting stuff for the first time. And so to answer your question is, so it's really now you're just going into ongoing mode.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And then the second question I got from our discussions earlier sounds like one of the issues we have is AR collection. Was that across all departments, or is there certain departments that groups are that we're having more collection issues than the other?
I don't know about that it's necessarily more collection issues. It's just you're going to have certain departments who actually have collections and those that don't. And just that the fact that it is a decentralized activity, there's just typically opportunity for improvement there. We're not saying that it's so much a significant issue But for sure, there's opportunity for improvement there. And just doing some testing there will help. I mean, that'll help identify that.
So is the issue, we're billing, but then there's no one to kind of make sure that it's being collected, or we're just not billing? Or
I'll let Marnie answer that, because it's for sure the former. We're working on it, yeah.
So we do have these third-party revenue collectors in the different departments. So it is decentralized, the monitoring is decentralized. For example, in finance, we only have we call it general billing, but our basic accounts receivable billing. We have a contract with a collection agency who, after a certain number of days, we send them the accounts, and they have better resources to collect those. They give us monthly reporting on their collection efforts. They visit once a year with kind of more detailed results of their collection efforts. But each department is doing that kind of monitoring for their own contracts.
Okay. I would tell from my personal experience, parking is quick to bill. Street sweeping, meters, I get that bill quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of those, like I said, with our general billing, after a certain number of days that it hasn't been collected, we have that outsourced. Parking citations is one, they take it from day one. So
Yeah.
okay. It differs by contract.
Okay, cool, thanks.
You're welcome.
Mr. Hensley?
Yes, I had a couple questions on some of the review items. It hadn't been talked about too much, but the division between payroll and human resources was highlighted in the report. And the staff's response was that many of the recommendations made have been or in the process of being implemented, but not all system controls can be implemented due to limiting staffing resources. And with the likelihood of occurrence high and the impact of occurrence high, can we know which parts are implemented, which ones are not? Are we getting the easy ones and leaving the big, issues out there, or what exactly is the status of that clarification?
I'd have to refer back to the HR and payroll responsibilities. I know even in that report, I think there were items that were resolved even while that report was taking place. But we're working towards those. As you may recall from the budget, the limited staffing is a big issue. Each of our departments had one position eliminated during this budget process, so that part's not getting any better.
I think that one was a separate audit that was presented to us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
the roles and
maybe audit's not the
responsibilities.
correct word, but
I can
review.
send that report to you since,
Oh, I have it.
got it?
Yeah, I've had it.
Good.
Okay, and the next one on the, about the strong fraud, waste, and abuse program. One thing I'd like to follow up on is, one of the things that were noted was that while the city has a policy, it doesn't have any policy to provide an alternate process in case the reporting is about the city manager, because the current process is to report to the city manager. So the response is staff disagrees with this assessment. So I'd just like a little clarification on, does that exist? If there is an issue with the city manager, how is that handled, and do we have a policy for that?
So what do I want to say there? So right now, those reports, I believe, go into HR analysts.
Right.
So a best practice is internal hotline, ethics hotline reports go to internal audit, because that way the reporter knows that it's not going to someone who might be the subject of that. In some places it goes to HR. It's not the end of the world. Is it the best? No. I don't think the city manager is necessarily like the issue in terms of a focus of what a report might be on. I think the bigger opportunity here is that, yes, the city has a hotline number, which is great. It's, I think, kind of probably far from the most robust tool that could be used without spending a bunch of money to do it. The city doesn't have a fraud, waste, and abuse program where it's defined how, in sort of more comprehensively, how it works. There's not education about it across the city. And so I think the opportunity to elevate that, because it's, and I believe the city hasn't gotten many or any reports from there recently. That in of itself isn't a good or bad thing. A good fraud, waste, and abuse program, I would say first and foremost is preventive, right? And so having good education, that we have an understanding across the city amongst employees what fraud, waste, and abuse is, and that if I'm doing it and I'm working with the 5 of you, 6 of you, I might worry that you might notice it and do something about it. And so really you want it to be preventive, so it's not about getting calls in. But the fact that you're getting none probably means there's not much awareness about it, and we're not marketing it well and training about it. And so I think it's a good opportunity as one of many controls in a best practice to make that more robust, and it doesn't take a lot of effort to do.
And it's pretty easy to have like a online training that employees can log
Do that,
into, and you
yeah.
just, it is done.
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
And
we
they-
do that, yep.
And they have to certify that they take it.
What we, just so you would know, what we typically do, this isn't right or wrong, but it's typical, doing training for the council and leadership in person, and then we record a training that's web-based, and then that can be disseminated to all employees. One of our clients, the county, we did in-person training for the whole dang county, and it was 3 shifts over the course of the day. I couldn't believe it. We were in a gymnasium, and they got everyone there. I've never seen it before. They also have the online version, but the point is, we want to educate. We want to educate people about it.
And bring the awareness and then give the
Yes.
impression that somebody's watching.
Exactly, right. Because really the preventive part is the most important.
Okay. And does the city agree with that, or are we taking any steps to, is that one of the things that we are doing, or one of the things that we are not doing moving forward?
We had an initial meeting to discuss it, and I think we're in deliberations on where that's going to go.
Okay.
How about that?
Very diplomatic. Okay, thank you very much.
I just have one question.
Sure. Just one.
Been working on this contract now for a couple of years.
Yeah.
I'm curious, from talking about some of the delays, hearing about some of the delays, and part of your role, you said, is identifying best practices and making sure they're implemented. Who's driving this process on our side, or how is this process being driven? Are you identifying and prioritizing items 1, 2, and 3 and delivering those to someone or some organization within the city, and then monitoring to make sure it moves forward? Or how does the process get driven along?
So a fair answer is kind of yes and no. So what do I mean by that? So yes, we're making recommendations about prioritization. No, I would say there was kind of a hiatus for a period of time, as sort of witnessed by the time that passed by. I think that has regained momentum. And how ultimately it's driven, or the way it works structurally, is ultimately we, in essence, we report to the council, typically through an audit committee, and so that's providing kind of independence. We work mainly with Eleanor as we always have someone who's the point person for us. And I think I would just say is, as long as we see continued momentum here, then I think we're all good. I don't think we want to see another sort of hiatus in between.
So we have an audit committee that you're working with?
You have an audit committee.
Okay. What do you do? What is your procedure if you're working with the audit committee, you believe something really needs to be done and it doesn't happen, or it doesn't appear to be happening in a fashion that you believe it under best practices should be moving forward?
Then we voice our opinion. I mean, it's not up to us, right?
Well, it's not up to you, but You
Right.
voice that to the city council, to the city manager? How do you go about kind of breaking the log?
Depends on the issue, but I'll just say, for example, fraud, waste, and abuse. So that's been voiced to the city manager, saying,
Okay.
I think this is the area worth having some focus,
Okay,
as an example.
okay, fair enough. Commissioner Solomon?
Mark, when we have procurement from our department heads, there's a lot of latitude there. Do you have, or can you help us centralize that, where it's, it all goes through a central portal through procurement so that it's reviewed? I know that right now the department head submits it, it's like a PO, and it gets approved, is basically how it works. Does it go through you, Marnie? Does it go through the treasurer's office? Does it go through Eleanor? If I'm a department head and I want to get a contract going, what's the procedure and how do we centralize that?
Well, the first step on a contract is city attorney. From there, it goes to city council. And then from there, the department will turn that into a purchase order.
But at the very beginning, the department head is the one that says, I need X. And they go out and they find a vendor to do X. So is there a standardized procedure that that department head goes through that every single department head does in order to follow along the guidelines? The contractor needs to have these requirements. It goes to the city attorney for review after all those requirements are presented? Or do they just pick somebody and the city attorney does that? I'm trying to find out if that situation is standardized or if it's sort of, it seems like it's haphazard.
Well, the municipal code dictates what has to happen. You have to get a certain number of quotes at this dollar figure. You have to have bids at this dollar figure. I know this commission's disagreement with the municipal code is that professional services do not have to be bid. So the municipal code completely dictates the beginning process.
But how is all of that logged? So does the department head enter all of everything that they've done? So if I'm looking to hire somebody, or I might get 5 resumes, and then I'll have those resumes loaded up, and then we'll go forward. We'll have all those people checking off different boxes, criteria for the hiring process, and that's loaded into a centralized database. So if I'm the department head and I have these requirements, I bring in 3 different people, and I review and I select one of them. How is the review process itself logged? Or is it just, are there notes, are there handwritten notes? Is it logged into a computer somewhere? What procedures must that department head follow?
Yeah, so at the time our terminology is the department enters a requisition into our finance system. And included in that has to be the documentation that they complied with the municipal code. Again,
Is this all handwritten, or is it loaded into a database somewhere?
It's scanned into our financial system, matched up with the purchase order.
Okay, great, thank you, that's what I was looking for.
Sure.
I'd like to make a motion.
Well, we still have another comment.
Oh, I beg your pardon, go ahead.
Commissioner Hensley?
Hi, I'm sorry. One more basic question. Previously, it was mentioned about the audit committee. Could you tell me who is on the audit committee or what departments are on that committee?
Sure, I don't recall the exact people on the audit committee, but the audit committee is the mayor, it's 2 council people, and then the city clerk and the city treasurer.
It's Councilman Gran and Councilman Horvath.
I volunteered, but they didn't take me.
Okay. Any other comments? No?
Well, I'd like to make a suggestion, a motion, that we create a letter to go to the city council that for those items that have been completed here for the clarify roles and responsibilities in the status update, that we urge them to address that in their next strategic plan meeting. And that for those items that are ongoing, that have a high likelihood of occurrence and a high impact of occurrence, that those also be addressed at their next strategic plan meeting.
Marnie, can we do that at this point, or do we have to discuss that in referrals to staff?
No, it relates to the
Okay.
Item.
Like for it,
Can I add a few items to your,
Please,
to your
yes,
list?
absolutely.
So, yes, I thought that we should do the same thing. So, as you already mentioned, we could recommend that this report, and you mentioned specific items and recommendations, informs the strategic plan for the upcoming year. We could also consider, the question was asked, where does this go and who has ultimate accountability for it? We might make a recommendation that there is a central accountability at the city for controls, and following up on items related to the Moss Adams plan/report and recommendations that they make, because there doesn't seem to be a central accountability. Another recommendation might be that all employees have the basic fraud, waste, and abuse training. Very simple to do. Perhaps Moss Adams sells such a product, but certainly people who work in the corporate world are required to log in, and you watch scenarios of what is basic accountability, what are fraudulent situations, and what to watch out for, and what your personal responsibilities are. This can take half an hour to an hour, and it's very simple to buy a product online. Again, perhaps you provide that will track that every employee does that, because this is a comprehensive report, and I appreciate your 5-year approach to it, but nothing like diving in with a little bit of teeth, because I think it needs it. And again, I appreciate the level of effort and the limited resources. But the first thing you need to do to have the culture of accountability is to educate all the employees. And that's a good way to start with that. So that could be a recommendation. And then, we don't want to speak out of both sides of our mouths, because we're always questioning staff. But there really, I think, should be a consideration of a staff member and typically it would reside within finance, who has the background and training to take a report such as this. And it wouldn't be their sole job, but, whoever it was, the controller, assistant controller would be a CPA who would have a background in auditing and understanding internal controls and internal control environments, and the ability to promulgate those practices out through the city and to help the different departments. So I had those additions to.
I'm comfortable with all of that, as an addition to a letter to council.
And that certainly would state we very much appreciate receiving the report. It has a lot of comprehensive observations that we're very thankful the city and that your Moss Adams is assisting in moving these along. But I think we recommend a sense of urgency, and we fully understand the budgetary environment that we're in, but this isn't going to get better over time. And I think that, when you give a report and tell all of us, you pick your own portion that you want to work on, that's a weakness right there. I mean, they're in accounting and in finance, in a business environment, there is a central responsibility for controls and compliance, and I think that's fundamentally lacking here. Thank you.
Because hope
is not a strategy.
Commissioner Hensley, any comments?
Yeah, I have two clarifying questions on the motion, if I may. The motion, you're talking about the internal controls review, likelihood of occurrence and impact of occurrence is high?
Yes, for those portions of the internal controls section where the likelihood of occurrence and the impact of occurrence were high.
Okay. And then one more clarifying question. At the previous meeting about this Moss Adams topic, there was a motion at that time to recommend within policy guidelines to amend the municipal code and forward to city council. Can I just ask, did that occur, or what the status of that
Yes, the letter was sent to council.
was? Okay. Okay, then if I may, well, first, to discuss the motion, I have to second, someone has to second the motion, is that correct?
Well, before we call the motion for a vote,
Yeah,
we did not invite public participation, so we need to do that. Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And please don't leave until we find out whether the public's going to get up and ask a question that we can't answer. Okay. Do we have any public participation comment?
Sheila Lamb, District 4. My comment is really to thank you all for your diligence and oversight of the issues, the financial issues here, and your forthrightness in ensuring that action is taken. Thank you so much. It gives me confidence that the city can move forward in remedying some of the challenges that are presented to them. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Anyone else?
So do we need a second on the motion that we're going to make a recommendation to council?
Yes.
I second.
Well,
Oh,
Hello, Redondo Beach City Treasurer Stephen Deals. I want to thank you for taking this up. It has been a long time coming, so I'm glad you see it. I think the question I liked hearing answered the most was where is the city in general on the heat map? And the answer could have been red, orange, yellow, or green. But the important thing is that you're getting an answer. And that's where we're at right now. Even if the report were that the city is in a dangerous place, that's good news because you're getting it. This is a big step that very few cities have taken. And so for those of you who are seeing this report, well, all of you are seeing it for the first time, but you've seen other portions of the report before. There are, 88 cities in LA County, and I think maybe only 1 or 2 are doing this. And statewide, we've got hundreds of cities, and only a handful are doing it. So Redondo Beach has really taken the lead on this, and I do want to thank city staff really for embracing it, because when the idea was presented to do this in a hotly political environment, which the city can be, it's hard to air your dirty laundry in public. And yet they've been willing to do it and take a look at this and find out what our strengths and weaknesses are. So I do want to thank the other elected officials and city leaders that did approve this. That includes the city council and mayor, and it includes the city clerk. And it does include department heads like Marnie. And I'm grateful that we have a vendor that can take this on, because not all can do this kind of work. So again, when I began the process of looking to get this done, most people didn't know what I was talking about, because they strictly were looking at financial audits and not process audits and compliance audits and procedural audits. So we've come a long way. It would have been nicer to get you this sooner, but you have it now, and I'm glad you got it, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Any other comments? Okay, before I call for the second, I have one other thought regarding this letter, and I guess it's more a question than it is a desire to put it in the letter, and certainly something for discussion. As we discussed, it's taken a long time to get to the point where we are right now, and our process is, of necessity, it's a slow process. I would like to see some way, or at least have some conversation about having some type of periodic reporting, at least back to this committee, a summary. We don't have to go through an hour-long discussion, but some type of regular reporting back, at least to this committee, if not recommendation that it go to the city council, to continue to monitor this, because it's one of those things that if it's not on the radar screen, if it's not visited regularly, especially in the budget environment that we're in right now, it's the kind of thing that'll get pushed to the side and it'll languish again, and I would rather not see it languish, especially with the value it appears to be bringing to us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for bringing that up. That is a great point. So certainly, if there's a 5-year plan, there is a rough calendar or thing that could be presented to us, and we could have periodic updates. And as you asked, how does Moss Adams and Mark react when something's not being followed up? Well, we should get continual updates on recommendations. And if they're not done, they just don't go away after 2 years. You still see, I get them, right? You still haven't done this. So that's the way we would see the follow-up, is in some sort of matrix of status, completed, in process, not started. And we can track it that way.
Okay. Do we, go ahead.
How often does this committee meet?
Yeah.
Monthly.
Monthly.
You don't even have every month.
No, I wasn't suggesting.
We've been very anxious to see you, though.
You did a good job, you can come back every month if you want.
You might have like a quarterly update.
Quarterly, yeah, that's
I mean, so what I was going to suggest is for our other cities with their audit committees, they meet at varying frequencies, but when they do, we give a status report every time. It's just a brief, standard sort of format status report that we use. So that could be something that we do quarterly for you or something like that.
Quarterly seems to make sense, especially as this process gains momentum, and that we make sure that it gets its feet and it keeps going. Yeah.
And some of those quarterly ones might be delivering a report, right? So, but something like that. So we'd be happy with that.
One of the things that we were hearing from the city manager when we were asking about this was that it wasn't ready. Now, certainly the one portion of it was completed now and can go. So you don't have a problem with these being ongoing items. Getting these status reports is great for us to go ahead and report through.
Yeah, I mean, our other audit committees, we just have, here are all the projects that are ongoing, right? Here's the status of them, kind of start, finish, date, where we are in the process, so that you know.
Are you reluctant for the current status of your work, the report? Not the portion of it that had been completed, but the internal controls section, are you reluctant to see that go to the city council in any way?
No, that's what it's supposed to do.
That's what it's supposed to do.
Right, because we gotta,
Okay.
this is about educating, right? Educating those up.
They're the sponsor of.
I understand. We had brought it up previously. I had asked the city council to review this, and the response was that the vendor didn't feel it was ready yet. And I don't want to mischaracterize that, but I want to make sure that you're comfortable with the current status of it going to city council.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was issued. This was issued in October of 17. Just had to say. You ready for the
So,
One other question before that.
okay, go ahead.
Are there additional fees regarding with Moss Adams right now going forward, or is your work complete in terms of the contract?
So our, no, it's not complete. So we have 2 projects that I would call ongoing right now. So the one is the policy and procedure inventory, of which we'll come up with a work plan, and then the fraud, waste, and abuse program development. That one's sort of in limbo right now in terms of what direction it's going to go. The policy inventory is certainly moving forward. So those are current projects that we're working on.
There's a comment at the last page of the report. It appears that there's an annual budget of $100,000.
Correct.
So that's the ongoing budget. Yeah.
Correct.
It was a 5-year contract, if I remember correctly.
Probably. I don't know.
It was multi-year. I don't remember how many years.
Remember it.
I believe the
Thank you.
contract's over next year.
So this discussion that we just had
21.
regarding quarterly reporting, do we also want to include that in the letter to advise the council that we're asking for that? Or is that something that we are just doing here and that's separate and apart from the letter?
No, I think
Well, I think that would have to be authorized by the council.
Yeah.
Because that is an additional responsibility for the vendor. So I think it should be included in the letter to have, that would have to be approved, I would suspect, would it not, Marnie or Eleanor?
Or let me ask this, Mark, how often does the audit committee meet? Or how often do you meet with the audit committee and provide reports to them right now?
The audit committee doesn't have a regular meeting schedule, and they meet very infrequently.
Probably 2 times a year.
So we do need to put this in the letter to the council, letting them know that we're requesting this and getting their authorization.
That would
so
lead
that-
to towards more accountability, to be certain.
And it's a normal part of a project like this.
Yeah,
Okay, yes.
okay, all right.
Did you get everything that we're looking for? Is there anything else that we didn't have in the letter? Or rather, you wrote all that down, I'm sure.
I will have to watch the the video and capture it all, and then I'll work with the chairman to make sure I've got it.
Feel free to send me a draft.
I got the notes.
Okay. I'm not going to try to report or repeat everything that we said. I'm going to have to watch the video myself. But we do have a motion to prepare this letter and submit it to the city council. Do I have?
Hensley has a
Do I have? Mr. Hensley, go ahead.
Oh, please. The honor is yours.
Thank you. I was waiting for the second. I'm sorry, my light's gonna have to wait until the second.
You can second.
Go ahead.
I'd actually like to make a small amendment to the motion, so it's gotta be, okay. So my amendment would be 2. The first one is I'd like to amend instead of sending it straight to council, I would like that letter to come back to us next month so we could finalize it rather than do it offline.
There appears to be time for that.
Yeah, because they're meeting in September, correct?
Correct.
So I think if it
Yeah,
came back to
there's
us in August. So my motion would be to amend the motion to have it come back to us next month in August for review and language approval.
Great idea. We'll put it on the agenda for next month.
Okay.
That should be fine. But in general, our committee has worked pretty well with having our ideas written by staff and by the chair, just as precedents. That's
But
fine, too.
we have done it both ways. When there is sufficient time, come back and give all of you an
But-
opportunity
Yeah.
to
We all seem to have a piqued interest.
wordsmith
Yeah,
it
my
or
only
whatnot.
concern with that is that, if I can make a suggestion, is that we want to convey a sense of urgency for these things. And if part of our recommendation is that this be added to strategic plan, that is going to happen in, say, September or October.
It said October.
We're going to want to convey that urgency to the council
Sooner.
as soon as we can.
Which would be the second week of August approximately, that
Right.
we meet the first week and then,
Sure.
and then we get the letter put
I think
together.
there's time.
Okay.
Expediency.
And my purpose for the motion was it gives more chance for public or to kind of put it out there so people can see what it is before we send it to them.
And as well, and I completely agree with you, and to your point, we can work on expressing the sense of urgency as well as just a list of recommendations.
Yeah, okay.
Fair enough.
Okay,
So
so
we have a motion.
That is a motion
and
to-
I think we all understand what it is. It's the letter that staff is going to prepare, and we will receive a draft, and it'll be on our agenda in the next meeting for review and finalization to send to the city council. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed?
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay, go
I
ahead.
had a second amendment, so I wasn't finished. So,
Let's go ahead and hear it anyway.
sorry about that. The second amendment the motion was to send items with high likelihood of occurrence and high impact of occurrence. But in reading the report, there's a lot of things, especially in the revenue and cash handling, where likelihood of occurrence is medium to high and impact is high. And so my amendment would just be to include things that are likelihood of occurrence in the internal controls review as medium to high or moderate to high, and impact of occurrence high, because it's likely, very likely to happen.
I think one of the follow-up items I had to that comment is that the report in general should inform the strategic plan. So,
Yeah, I think that's how we were.
It's pretty broad.
As I recall the way the conversation was, that's kind of what we were talking about. But, Marnie, would it be acceptable if Commissioner Hensley has any additional comments or thoughts that he could send them directly to you? And since we're going to be
Sure,
reviewing
since
this.
it won't be finalized
Yeah,
until
that's
you all
fine.
see it. Sure.
I just wanted to express why I wanted that change, rather than just
And this is something that you can, staff can share with us on a group email to review ahead of time, or if you have comments, if I'm not mischaracterizing it, that if you email staff, you could do that, just don't email us.
Yeah.
But you know Robert's Rules of Orders really well.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for the interjection.
Okay. So the last thing on the agenda is, we talked about the
Well,
letter,
I
but
think
we
we
need,
have to
we need to
receive
have the
and file.
vote to receive and file.
Receive and file. Motion to.
I'm sorry, we actually haven't voted on the motion.
We did.
The amended motion.
Oh, the amended motion?
Well,
Okay.
okay, I'm sorry. I second the amendment to the motion.
The amendment to the motion? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? I didn't think so. Okay.
I have a motion to receive and file the report.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
I do want to thank staff and elected officials and Moss Adams for this report. And while, we take it very seriously, I want to convey only for myself and not speak for everybody that I very much am in the spirit of, as Mark has expressed for Moss Adams, that we're not here to pick on people. We're here to foster continual improvement, and we really congratulate the city on taking this big step, and hopefully we can play a role in moving this forward. Thank you.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, Eleanor.
You betcha.
Oh, she's changing chairs.
Uh-oh. She wants the soft
She's
seat.
moving into.
Okay. Next item is a county fire feasibility study fiscal impact. Marnie, I think you're the only one here to talk on that. So you're in the hot seat again.
Okay, good evening. The commission asked to see more details for the fiscal impact of the county fire feasibility study and to see projections of those impacts into the future. And I'm here this evening to provide you with those. The county proposal that you have in your blue folder packet gave the city two options. An option A, which is their recommended option, and that would include a reduction in our current staffing levels. They also presented an option B, which is much closer to our current staffing level, and so this is the one that I'll be comparing to as we run through the numbers. So here's a page that you've seen recently. It's from the proposed budget. It's the fire department's budget by expense type, with a total proposed budget of $23,367,488. So that's our starting point when we make a comparison with the county's proposal. So here's another look at the same budget with some more breakdown of those items, and then whether they would remain city costs if we went with county fire, or if they would be eliminated. So the first four items on here, the wage and benefits, the citywide emergency services, CalPERS normal cost, and CalPERS unfunded accrued liability, those all total to the personnel number that we saw on the previous slide. Most of these costs, since the personnel would be transferring to the county, most of the costs would as well. The overtime number for the citywide emergency services, that would be transferred to a different department. That's something that a different department would work on. It's pretty much our emergency preparedness function, and that would need to remain with the city. And then the larger one is the CalPERS unfunded accrued liability amount. There was a lot of talk during the budget process about this. So you can see both portions broken out here. There's the normal cost, more for the ongoing PERS expenditures, and then there's these, it's sometimes referred to as the CalPERS legacy costs that we would still have to pay even if the employees transferred to the county. That amount will eventually drop off, but it's way beyond the 10-year projection period that we looked at. When we get down to M&O, almost all would transfer, of these costs would transfer to the county. Again, there's the small amount for citywide emergency services that would remain. And then our beloved internal service fund allocations. Some of those would remain with the city and be redistributed to other departments, and others would be eliminated. So we can take a more detailed look at those internal service fund allocations here. Liability insurance. Two components to that, claims and premiums. The claims, we're projecting that they would drop off in 5 years. It's a awfully small amount, and we do, when we calculate the claims charge, we are doing that using a 5-year average. So we're projecting within that 5 years, it'll drop off. The premiums for liability insurance are basically our property insurance. Because the county proposal talks about the city basically being the landlord and the county leasing the fire stations, we're still going to need to insure those fire stations. So those costs remain. Vehicle maintenance, again, two components to that. There is the fuel component. Although the way the county proposal describes it, the city would still be purchasing the fuel, it would be reimbursed by the county for those costs. So that part of the internal service fund charge would drop off immediately. And then the second component to that is repairs and maintenance. So that is done by our Fleet Services division of our Public Works Department. The Fleet Services division, like so many, is pretty small. It would not go away or reduce its operations. We did take a look at the expenditures of that division, and in there could identify parts and repair costs that were applicable to fire apparatus. So we in our calculation have taken those costs out, but all the remaining costs of the Fleet Services division would just be redistributed to the rest of the city. Building occupancy. So there's a lot built into that number. One of the items in that charge is for utility costs. Those we've taken out of the costs that would remain with the city. In the county proposal, they talk about how they would maintain the fire stations up to a certain dollar limit. Certainly, the utilities would fall within that dollar amount, so we can take those out. But again, just like we were talking about with vehicle maintenance, the building maintenance division of Public Works, again, not a large division at all. And we don't expect that their function would be reduced any. They would simply be working on other facilities. Information technology maintenance, that has, again, we can start with the staffing levels and the majority of their ongoing costs, which serve the whole city. We don't expect those to be reduced. There are some items that would drop off immediately. Phone lines to the fire stations, those would drop off immediately.